Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode. Today we're talking about compassion-focused therapy. And if you're like me prior to researching this, you've got no idea what that is. So, in the world of theoretical models, we've got a bunch of different theories out there. Everything from psychoanalysis to Gestalt therapy to person-centered. And what ended up happening is over the last little while, we have third wave forms of therapy. This is like a modified, adapted version of it. Think of it like an update for your iPhone, right? It's the same thing as my prof would say. It's just kind of repackaged slightly differently with the focus being on a slightly different thing. So it's the same ideas and principles largely, but it's been modified, it's been adapted, it's been twisted. So that's all you gotta know. And I know when I say compassion-focused therapy, when I say CFT, everyone's immediately gonna think about, oh, CBT, I know that. Which is not CBT. These are two different ones, but there are similarities, and CFT definitely borrows a lot from CBT, as do the other third wave form therapies. So we're going to talk about its history, a little bit about what the theoretical model is, as well as talking about techniques, applications, which is a fancy way of saying who it's aimed at, the evidence supporting it, and we're also going to talk about critiques. So folks, compassion-focused therapy, what is compassion? When I say compassion, what comes to mind? And if you Google this, you're going to get something along the lines of showing genuine concern for the suffering of other people. Because I know you've heard that word before. Oh, she's such a compassionate person. Or, Billy's going through a really hard time. Let's try to be extra compassionate towards him right now. So when you think of compassion, I want you to think of self-care, self-love, being kind to yourself, kind of in that same idea. So it's based on CBT, it's based on cognitive behavioral therapy, but this therapy has a unique focus on shame and on self-criticism. So where did this therapy come from? There was a clinical psychologist by the name of Paul Gilbert who kind of coined this and created this idea way before the 2000s. And what Dr. Gilbert did was he looked between the link of depression, shame, and self-criticism. He's like, look, if you take someone who's experiencing depressive symptoms, chances are they don't look like, okay, close your eyes. Unless you're driving, then don't do it. But if you can, close your eyes, think about what someone who's experiencing depressive symptoms looks like. They don't look like Superman, right? You don't need a PhD to know what someone looks like. Chin down, hunched over, don't have the greatest posture, probably looking down when they're walking. Their tone probably doesn't change much. You're not going to see much enthusiasm in their face, generally speaking. And Gilbert's like, man, he's like, I understand that depression has this impact on a person and negative thoughts and negative beliefs. And there's usually a lot of shame attached to it and self-criticism, which couldn't be anything such as the should mindset, right? I should be better. I should be smarter. I should be married by now. I should be graduated by now. So any that sort of criticism and feeling shame, feeling embarrassed for it. And he believes one of the biggest explanations to back up this kind of idea is from an evolutionary perspective. Gilbert believes we've been evolutionarily wired to be sensitive to shame and to criticism and to harm and to threat. Why? Because if someone's raiding the village, you got to be really quick you don't have time to think logically necessarily. Sometimes you just have to think, there's a tiger in front of me, it's time to run. There's no time to think about nuances. And finally, Gilbert was saying, well, look, if we believe that depression is linked with shame and it's linked with self-criticism, the shield to help someone protect themselves from becoming engulfed into that world is self-compassion. And he believed that if we have self-compassion, it can help protect us from some of those negative effects that shame and self-criticism would have. So CFT, compassion-focused therapy, is based on a bunch of different fields such as evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, cognitive behavioral therapy, and Buddhist psychology. So going back to what I said earlier, Gilbert noticed that we were very sensitive to threat. When that tiger shows up, I don't have time to logically think about what I need to do. Most likely, the fight or flight response gets activated, and I think either I'm going to try to fight it or I'm going to try to run away. If it's the former, God help you. If it's the latter, good luck outrunning it. But that's what we're thinking. And because of this, we can be prone to experience more negative emotions. And negative emotions directly lead to self-criticism and judgment. Another cognitive distortion in CBT just to highlight the similarities here, is when you think about, oh, if I feel something, that means it's real. If I feel upset, like I should trust my feeling, right? How many times have you read, you should listen to your gut? Really? I should listen to my gut. What if I feel so anxious that my gut tells me to never leave my room again? I should listen to my gut, huh? So we take these things with a grain of salt. So the CFT focuses, look, if we can have compassion towards ourselves and towards other people, we can help combat, we can help alleviate some of these negative symptoms that are brought on by shame and by self-criticism. So it's really, really important, if you go to a therapist who trains in this, that they create a safe environment where a client feels comfortable to explore themselves, your thoughts, and your emotions. Now, what does CFT actually look like? Because you're listening to me probably going like, Daniel, this sounds great. This sounds wonderful, like a monk on a mountain. You got to love yourself, and you've got to love other people. Yeah. But what are actual techniques if you walked into a therapy room right now? Here's a couple. One of them is called mindfulness. Now, why? Why would that be? You're very distressed. You walk in to see a therapist, and they're like, hey, I hear you. We're going to work on mindfulness. Why would they do that? Like, what benefit could mindfulness have? So mindfulness entails being fully aware of what you are sensing in the current moment. It could be emotions, thoughts, physiological symptoms. You feel your heart racing, you feel your palms are sweaty. And here's the key. Ready, folks? Without judgment. So you acknowledge the emotions, whatever they are. You acknowledge the thoughts, whatever they are, without judging yourself. And this gives you the ability to recognize negative patterns of thinking and of behavior, only when judgment is not present. So that's one. Another technique is known as imagery. So imagery could be, you come in and the therapist says, look, I want you to visualize someone who you think is a very compassionate person, or visualize yourself being very compassionate towards someone else, or visualize other people being compassionate towards you. So the key here is you want to think about compassion. We want to think about showing concern, helping people out who are suffering. And I know suffering is like this great heavy word of like it has to be through war or a famine or something. But folks, it could just be a tough week. Your friend just lost a loved one and you show up out of the blue with chicken wings. Is that a compassionate thing to do? So one of the ideas is you want to visualize yourself engaging in compassionate behaviors, or visualize other people engaging in compassionate behaviors towards you. So there's an emphasis of concern and of care towards others and towards yourself. There's also behavioral activation is another technique. And behavioral activation, it's very, very, very simple. If you've ever listened to a gentleman by the name of Jocko Willink or David Goggins, this is essentially what they talk about all the time. But instead of using the words behavioral activation, they use the word discipline. Behavioral activation says this. You show up to the therapist and you go, look, life sucks. I don't enjoy anything. I don't want to do anything. I don't feel like doing anything. And the therapist's like, well, what did you like to do before you started feeling this way? And maybe you're like, you know what? I was an amazing salsa dancer. And the therapist is going to say, all right, I want you to start dancing. And you go, but no, I don't feel like dancing. And your therapist will say, I don't care what you feel like doing. I want you to do it anyways. I want you to do it anyways. Because so often we wait to feel like doing something, and that feeling never comes. Rather than doing something, and then we could feel better afterwards. The last technique that I'm going to share with you folks, let's say two more. I don't want to bore you too much. So, second to last one is letter writing. So this is where you write a letter to yourself or to other people expressing compassion or kindness. So I know people are thinking there like, oh, Daniel, that's kind of like sitting there and thinking about what you're grateful for. A little bit, yeah, there's definitely overlap, but there's a specific emphasis on this compassion and this kindness piece either to yourself or to other people. Maybe no one has ever said, hey, when you went through that breakup, you were really resilient and not going back to smoking, which you've just quit. Maybe no one's told you that, but you had that thought. But you've never said it out loud. Maybe that's worth writing in the letter. The last sort of technique is called compassionate mind training. And essentially, this is a structured program, a course of sorts that involves educating clients through these different principles of CFT through homework, assignments, or group work. So this could mean, have you heard of these workshops that you can go to? Some of them are 2 hours long, 3 hours long. Some of them are 6 hours long, 3 hours on Saturday, 3 hours on Sunday. This is kind of like that. And it's like a training workshop, and it'll last approximately 12 weeks. And what happens across these 12 weeks is you get educated on what CFT is, on thoughts, on feelings, very CBT-esque. You also get homework, you get assignments, and you get to meet a bunch of like-minded people who are also trying to better themselves. So, Daniel, CFT sounds great. It sounds wonderful. It sounds like this mindful, great experience, but who is it for? Like, does it apply to me? Here's a number of things that I found evidence for from peer-reviewed articles that it does apply for. Ready? Anxiety, depression, trauma, eating disorders, and personality disorders. Let's think about these for a moment. How could CFT be applied to anxiety? So when I talk about anxiety specifically, I'm talking about generalized anxiety, social anxiety, and OCD. So think about being compassionate to yourself and what that could mean for anxiety. So if you're someone who's worried about going out or going to a party because you don't know how people are going to judge you or what people are going to say, and then guess what happens? That voice starts to self-criticize. Go, holy smokes, I'm a loser. And I'm just pretending I'm not a loser. It's only a matter of time until people find out. And then I can never leave my house again. But self-compassion acts as the protective shield. It's like the other voice. So if you've got like that one guy on your shoulder who's the negative self-criticism, self-compassion is supposed to be the other one. And very much like CBT, if we can challenge those thoughts, we can decrease the anxiety. For depression, exactly the same thing. We're targeting those negative beliefs and in turn impacting on negative emotions. By having compassion towards ourselves, we can not argue against, but at the very least identify and begin to challenge some of these irrational beliefs that we hold, such as, nobody likes me. And if you have compassion for yourself, it's kind of hard to hold both of those ideas of nobody likes me, but I have compassion for myself and I like me. Well, I'm somebody, so I guess I can't say nobody likes me. So that's one way to kind of get the ball moving. Think about CFT in terms of traumatic events. So oftentimes people will say something like, I was a person who was like this. I went through that traumatic event and now I'm a different person because of it. Like I've changed. My identity has changed. And this, folks, is really disempowering. Why? Because we're emphasizing this idea that in this story, we're a victim. Like something negative was done to us that we were powerless to stop or powerless to change. And in doing this, we recognize that if I'm a victim and if it's been done to me, well then there's nothing I can do about it. So the benefits of CFT and trauma is that we can sit there and we can think, okay, I'm not going to judge anything. Not my thoughts, not my feelings, not my physiological symptoms. I'm simply going to become aware of them without judgment. For eating disorders, we can imagine how CFT has an impact on self-compassion when we think about things like body image, what it means to be healthy, and what is healthy weight gain and weight loss. We know that there's a relationship between depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and body image, especially in young teenage girls. So if we can emphasize this narrative of compassion towards ourselves and towards other people, there is a relationship there between compassion and between those negative body image issues which lead to eating disorders. Finally, personality disorders, like I know like we use words all the time like, oh, so-and-so's a narcissist, but there's actual clinical diagnoses of these things. And again, it's important to recognize the role that compassion plays when we look at things like self-criticism, when we look at shame, when we know we might have narcissistic tendencies. That doesn't mean you're diagnosed. But maybe you know there's some things that you shouldn't be doing. And oftentimes when we criticize ourselves, guess what? It doesn't make you feel any better. It makes you feel more guilty. And it makes you withdraw more. And if you think you can't change, you go, well, I guess this is who I am. And I'm forced to feel this way. So in the end, folks, there are an abundance of applications that we can use for. Now, here's some empirical evidence I want to throw at you about what some of the researchers have found in relation to CFT, its techniques, and its impacts on these different psychological outcomes. So, Fox and her colleagues did this kind of 12-week structured program, as I talked about earlier. They had a bunch of university students in like a group counseling setting. They educated them on CFT, the benefits of self-compassion, the impacts of self-criticism and shame. And what they noticed was there was a huge report in decreases in anxiety frequency and anxiety intensity. For depression, two colleagues with the name of Strode and Griffiths looked at several studies which had clients report less depressive symptoms after seeing a therapist who specialized in CFT. And also a study by Summer Spickerman revealed that CFT has promising results for self-help. Now, when I say self-help, I want you to think about all those guides that are out there for free, all those online courses, and how if we have access to this stuff, and if a person can do it by themselves, it would cut out the middleman of having to see a therapist. So there's lots of promising things there. In regards to trauma, there's lots of evidence that shows if we create a safe environment, it's going to make a client feel more comfortable to open up. Thus, they're going to be less likely to, one, criticize themselves, and secondly, introduce those irrational beliefs that they had earlier. In eating disorders, we know that excessive weight gain is associated with shame, and we also know that individuals who took this 12-week kind of structured program with a therapist who was trained in CFT, they reported decreased feelings of shame about their weight and an increase in compassion. And finally, a study which looked at personality disorders found that a 16-week program lowered depressive symptoms, stress symptoms, and shame for all the parties involved. The last thing I want to talk about, folks, is critiques. So here are a couple of critiques of CFT. One of them is it's still a relatively new approach, so it doesn't have that empirical evidence, that backing that, let's say, a CBT would. A second one is it is quite complex. So this idea of having like compassion for yourself and compassion for others, it sounds super simple on the surface, but when life is hard and we're talking about a lost loved one or a lost job or school stress, all of a sudden looking at someone and be like, hey man, you just have to be more compassionate. Like it's a weird thing to wrap your head around. Like, what do I have to be compassionate for exactly? This leads us to our next critique, which is like this emphasis on positive effect, where it's exactly that. It's such an heavy emphasis on look at the positive aspect, that it's going to turn a lot of people off. There might be cultural limitations, like other cultures might not be as big on this idea of self-compassion as others. There's also a limited focus on interpersonal issues, meaning there's a lot of focus on the person themselves, focus on your stress, on your distress, on your sadness, on your anger. But there isn't much focus about what you can do in your relationships. There isn't as much focus what you could do at your job, talking to your boss. What if your shame is coming from your boss? What if the anxiety is coming from your spouse? How can we address your relationships there? So overall, CFT is very promising. It's got a lot of interesting ideas and very nuanced ideas. The problem becomes it's just really, really new. And like anything in life, we need to give it time. It's looking promising, and with more empirical evidence and with more graduate programs being able to administer CFT and being able to train their students in CFT, it is looking like an interesting option for people. So CBT, it's not like it's the only route. You have ACT, you have DBT, and now we can add compassion-focused therapy to the mix. Thank you very much for listening, and take care of yourself. Bye-bye.